Good morning, everyone. What we have for you today feels more like an arts festival than a session with a supervisor, as we have two local offerings, a book and a film to discuss. Now, Nick is covering the film and I'm taking the book, but it's not the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, it's the handbook. And I'm going to be giving you feedback on the reviews it's had and give an update on the revisions. But I promise you there'll be no book readings from me on business risk assessments or customer due diligence. Now, we had some encouraging feedback on the handbook from the joint consultation with the Policy and Resources Committee on the revisions to the Bailiwicks AML and CFT framework. I'm not going to identify the authors, but we had comments that the handbook was easier to navigate, that the handbook was more intuitively structured, and even that the Commission had done a great job. We also had feedback from one significant industry association thanking the Commission for listening to a lot of points that industry had been making and genuinely trying to accommodate them. Now, I like to think that these reviews might find their way onto the final version of the handbook, though we are still waiting to hear if it has made Richard and Judy's book club. Now, we had 75 responses to the consultation, which was encouraging after the steps we had taken to meet as many people as possible during the consultation period, with seminars, drop-ins and trips to Alderney and Sark. In all, we spoke with upwards of 500 people, so roughly the number of people here today. And as a result, we have nearly 400 pages of feedback to pore over in response to the revised elements of the regime, which were proposed regarding additional customer due diligence, politically exposed persons, the new beneficial ownership definition, use of the intermediary arrangements in the fund sector, and financial crime compliance arrangements. Now, this slide shows the profile of the respondents, which includes the industry associations as well as the firms. Now, as much as I'd have loved the handbook to be a popular read, it does at least appear to have been widely viewed as the must-read book this summer. Now, we set out on this exercise with two aims: to meet international standards and wanting the finance sector to remain competitive. Therefore, we very much appreciate the detailed response and the effort which went into them to give us the industry perspective. Now, clearly we, as in P&R, which sets the legislation, and the Commission, which issues the rules and guidance, have a lot to go through. The Commission will be issuing a detailed report on the feedback that the consultation brought in, but today I'll give you a high-level preview. Now, broadly, feedback fell into the following categories: PEP relationships, the proposed additional customer due diligence measures, use of intermediaries in the fund sector, and financial crime compliance arrangements. Now, the questions around PEPs drew most interest, with 90% of respondents replying to questions on whether, based on evidence of money laundering and terrorist financing risks, there were circumstances where a risk-based approach could be taken to relationships with former PEPs. Now, we received some really good examples where, based on the evidence that money laundering risks were lower, a risk-based approach could be justified. So, in conjunction with P&R, the Commission will be giving very careful consideration over whether there should be any changes to the current mandatory enhanced measures that apply to all PEPs, which recognise that not all former PEPs present the same level of risks. In other words, recognise what could be described as degrees of peppiness. However, there are two key issues to emerge from the feedback, which relate to the recommendations made by both the IMF and by Moneyval, who are both able to take a very close look at how an international finance centre operates when they carried out their evaluations in 2010 and 2014. Firstly, additional customer due diligence, or ACDD. Now, this comprises of a set of mandatory measures proposed to address the IMF and Moneyval recommendation that the types of customers to whom enhanced measures must be applied should be expanded. The concerns raised included that ACDD was counter to the risk-based approach, because it mandated due diligence to apply to a wide range of customers, the customers which are reflected up there. And that it was creating an additional layer of due diligence to that of simplified, standard and enhanced. Now, the measures that were put forward in the handbook were lifted from the Jersey regime, which addressed the exact same recommendation, but before its Moneyval evaluation. Now, the feedback we had was well made, and it will be considered, but realistically, there is likely to be limited scope for much movement here. And that's because these types of customers to whom the additional measures should be applied are identified by the FATF as potentially higher risk situations. And these types of customers form the bulk of Guernsey's client base. Furthermore, it's unlikely that the international community will show much patience if for a third time we are found not to put in place measures that are commensurate with the experts' recommendations. However, we are looking at whether we can recast the measures proposed as part of enhanced due diligence, rather than as separate additional measures which present Guernsey as having a regime with 4 separate tiers of due diligence instead of 3. Now, we're going to be reaching out to industry on this topic, most likely through the industry associations, towards the end of this year. Now, the second issue relates to the use in the fund sector of the intermediary provisions, which Moneyval recommended should not be allowed on collective investment schemes which have a very limited number of investors, because the underlying beneficial owners will not be known to the fund or to the Guernsey Fund Administrator. Now, it's a very sector-specific technical issue, and here we have been meeting with representatives of the fund sector to explore an alternative solution to address Moneyval's recommendation, whereby the current measures in the existing handbook are largely retained, but with additional periodic reporting from the sector on its use of intermediary relationships. So in essence, what we're looking at here is not so much regulatory requirements, but a supervisory response. Now, the final area for me to cover on feedback is in relation to the new requirement in the FATF's revised standards that firms should appoint a compliance officer at manager level. Now, in order to address this new requirement, the draft legislation and rules proposed that firms must appoint an appropriately qualified and sufficiently independent compliance officer with specific responsibility for the firm's AML-CFT policies, procedures and controls. Now, the feedback we had on this ranged from the creation of an artificial distinction between the compliance officer and reporting officer roles, that there would be a lot of extra work for the firms and the Commission on creating a new notifiable position, to questions on what appropriately qualified means, and concerns, understandably from very small firms, about how they could ensure sufficient independence of the compliance officer from other duties that their staff might have. Now, I hope I can put to rest any concerns that this new post means more spending on compliance. It doesn't. That decision rests with a firm to determine based on the type and volume of business it has and the risks it faces. Now, the compliance officer role could be held by your reporting officer, or the position could be held by the individual who is the compliance officer responsible with compliance under one of the regulatory laws, such as the Protection of Investors Law, or by another sufficiently senior and knowledgeable individual. It'll be up to you to decide and to tell us. Now, we will consider what further guidance we can give around our expectations on the independence of the individual who will hold the compliance officer role, and elaborate further on what appropriately qualified means, as well as reconsidering the financial crime titles, which drew some interesting feedback, that were proposed for both the compliance officer and the reporting officer. Now, this is a requirement in the international standards, and it's a measure which both Jersey and the UK have taken up. So again, it's another area where there isn't really much room to move on. Now, I've been making a couple of references to this lack of flexibility in applying measures which the standards require, and that's for a couple of reasons. The FATF expectations are very granular, and they are set out in quite a lot of documentation. They set them out in recommendations. accompanying those recommendations are very detailed interpretive notes. And on top of that, the FATF have issued a methodology which reinforces those expectations, which is used when a jurisdiction is being assessed against the standards. Secondly, throughout this exercise, the Commission sought, and it continues to seek to ensure, that revised measures are pitched at the standards to put Guernsey as much as possible on a par with its competitors, and not above them. There's therefore little gold-plated trim for us to cut back on. Now we have, and we continue to study, FATF evaluation reports, and we examine and continue to examine measures which apply in comparable jurisdictions, such as the Isle of Man and Jersey. And we look at how countries in the European Union, including the UK, are implementing the fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive. Now we are, or soon will be, engaging with you primarily through the industry associations and principally around additional customer due diligence before finalising the handbook. Therefore, realistically, the final version of the handbook is unlikely to be issued before the latter part of Q1, early Q2 next year. Once issued, there will be a couple of months lead-in before the measures come into effect. Now, as a heads up for your own planning to revise your policies and procedures, there are actually many parts of the revised draft handbook where subsequent changes between versions we consulted on and the final version are likely to be minimal. This includes important areas on assessing risk, undertaking business risk assessments, introduced business, monitoring arrangements, reporting suspicion, staff recruitment and training, and record keeping. Now, we have been asked about the National Risk Assessment because of the tie-in it has with the proposed draft legislation for firms to consider the output from the NRA when considering their own risks and controls. Now, if initially there is no National Risk Assessment to draw upon, you cannot be pulled up on this. However, an assessment of the terrorist financing risks the bailiwick faces was issued to industry through Themis last year. I would really encourage you to take a look at it because it includes some very useful information on understanding where the terrorist financing risk to the bailiwick lies. Now, I've given you the main themes of the feedback and outlined the next steps. Please be assured that the Commission will continue to do so, is listening and will continue to do so, and that we will flag the changes that are made between the additions of the handbook that you saw this summer and the final published version. I'm now handing you to Nick for the second part of our Financial Crime Festival to fulfil the obligations the FATF impose upon supervisors to provide industry with feedback and guidance on regulatory issues. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Before I release the world premiere of Season 2 of Salary Financial Services, I would like to share with you some practical examples of how to mitigate financial crime risks. At the last presentation, I stated that those firms who can clearly articulate their risk appetite are also the same firms who put in place strong policies, procedures and controls to mitigate the risks of money laundering and terrorist financing. Today, I would like to develop that theme further. We acknowledge that it's highly unlikely that firms can make money without taking risks. Therefore, boards must ensure that they put in place proportionate systems and controls to mitigate identified risks, and in particular, from my perspective, financial crime risks, both at the front line, that is your operation and business units, and the second line being your compliance and risk units. However, boards should not only identify financial crime risks and put in place relevant systems and controls, they also need to ensure that they review and receive appropriate management information to enable them to adequately oversee the business and ensure that the controls are working. Hence, this is why we undertook a thematic review of financial crime governance, risk and compliance frameworks at fund administrators and fund managers at the end of 2016 and extended this to fiduciaries this year. I'm glad to say that the thematic review of smaller fund firms generally indicated that there was a culture of compliance. That is, firms had put in place compliance monitoring programs which covered a broad range of tests, and boards were regularly receiving compliance and risk reporting, enabling them to oversee the business appropriately. I would encourage you to review the report, which is now on our website. However, there are 4 areas with scope for improvement which could apply to all regulated firms, which I would like to run through with you today. These 4 areas are detailed on the screen and in a self-assurance help sheet, which you would find on your seats, which you can take back to your office and discuss with your colleagues. We are not expecting these forms to be returned to us. They are purely for your benefit. In the meantime, you might want to reflect on how you are doing in comparison with what I'm about to say. We identified that with some firms there was a disconnect between the risks identified by the board on one hand and the mitigation of those risks on the other hand. For example, a firm had identified bribery and corruption risk as inherently high to its business. But the compliance monitoring programme did not have a specific compliance test to cover bribery and corruption. Now, bribes can often be disguised as commissions or consulting fees. Therefore, compliance tests could be applied to payments out of the scheme property. Of the 10 firms we visited, 6 had compliance monitoring programmes which did not fully take into account the risks identified by the board in its business risk assessment. Of these 6 firms, 5 had outsourced their compliance function to a third-party compliance firm, implying that a generic monitoring programme had been provided to the firm, without any subsequent revision to reflect the nature of the firm's business model and the financial crime risks associated with that business model. We've also identified a similar issue from our thematic review of fiduciaries. For example, we came across one test from a fiduciary which was testing whether it had an MLRO, which was quite a bizarre test, bearing in mind that the MLRO was the one conducting the tests. I would like to reaffirm, though, that we have no objection to the use of outsourced compliance providers. However, you must ensure that your business risk assessment and your compliance monitoring programmes are relevant to your business. For example, you would not buy an off-the-shelf IT system without checking that it's compatible with your existing systems. Therefore, to ensure that boards check that their compliance monitoring programmes focus on the areas which they perceive cause them the greatest risk to their business and are not simply tick-box exercises. Whilst 100% of firms sampled are monitoring sanctions, a number of firms rely on automated sanction screening systems, of which one firm in our survey did not undertake any tests to assess if the automated screening processes were operating correctly. Automated systems are only effective if the IT programs supporting them are correctly configured. I'm drawing this issue to your attention because it's not an issue isolated to the thematic. A number of firms who rely on automated sanctions, payments and screening, adverse media screening systems, have subsequently found that their IT systems are not operating correctly. Examples we have seen include a system which pulled data from a historic client database, and on another occasion the payment screening software had been switched off for a specific type of payment. I would therefore ask all firms who use automated systems to ensure that those systems are subject to regular testing by your internal audit or your compliance function. Whilst it was evident that firms were regularly reviewing their compliance arrangement and noting compliance reports, board minutes for some firms did not reflect the board's consideration of AML-CFT risks. In this regard, the board minutes only recorded that compliance matters such as AML-CFT training, conflicts of interest, gifts, and that the compliance report had been discussed. We have no record of what those discussions were. I would ask boards to consider how they show that they take compliance with AML/CFT legislation seriously. Half of the firms visited did not include in their compliance report to the board information on the time taken between an internal disclosure of a suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing and the decision by the MRO as to whether to report the suspicion to the FIS. Suspicions of money laundering and terrorist financing must be disclosed as soon as possible to the FIS in order not to delay or hinder an investigation into potential criminality by law enforcement authorities. I would also ask boards to consider how they satisfy themselves that their MRO is making suspicious reports on a timely basis. Okay, last year we introduced you a fictitious firm called Salary Financial Services, which amalgamated the worst CDD deficiencies from various firms we had visited since the division was created in 2012. I'm pleased to announce that Salary Financial Services is returning today, albeit the culture of the firm has noticeably changed in some respects, but in other respects further work is required. My character has reformed, but rest assured some of Nick and Andy's old habits die hard. To set the scene, the poor practices identified by the on-site team when visiting this fictitious firm resulted in sanctioning by the Commission, but also the imposition of various risk mitigation programmes to reduce the risks identified by the Commission. Therefore, the on-site team are returning to Salary Financial Services to assess how they're getting on with remediating the issues identified. As before, some of the acting is somewhat exaggerated for entertainment purposes, but we hope you'll find the key messages useful. The 15-minute clip we're about to show you will expand on the issues of risk appetite, risk mitigation and board oversight that I discussed earlier. To conclude, Fiona and I would like to express our appreciation to our colleagues for taking part in this production, and following the film, Fiona and I are happy to take questions. Thank you.
CFT, should I know what that means?
The majority of the issues stem from our previous managing director, Mr. Rasputin.
Got an African pet. They've done risk reviews. There's just a couple of questions around his source of wealth.
Mamma mia.
Yeah. You've seen these photos? He's had some work done.
That you received the fees from a taxi driver in cash.
Yeah, that's right.
It's Mr. T. So the A-team have gone rogue in West Africa.
Well, on new business, yes, but as this is existing business,
I'll take it from here.
Look, Tonya, it's really quite simple. He's just a man trying to get on and start a new life. What's wrong with that?
Exactly. Which client? Is that Mufasa? I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know what I'm doing.
What more do they want? Tonya, do you have your business card?
Yes, I do.
Thanks very much. Does it have your personal number on it?
Thank you for joining us today for the Financial Crime Division follow-up visit to Salary Financial Services.
your commentators today are Kat and myself, Paul. In terms of the lineups for the Commission, we have Tonya, Wade and Douglas.
And for Salary Financial Services, we have Nick, Andy, Kath and Darren. Let's go to the action.
Okay, well, thank you for meeting with us today.
You're welcome. I think you'll find we're a much different firm to the one you visited last year.
Tonya, it's so good to see you again. Have you changed your phone number since we last met? I've left you a few messages.
Well, let's just keep things on track here. The purpose of today's visit is that we're here to assess and to see how you're progressing with the RMPs that we put in place as a result of our last visit. So I'd be grateful if you could give us an update, please.
Sure. Well, I guess you could say we're in a period of transition. The previous MRO wasn't up to the job, so we got rid of him, and we got another compliance professional to assist us with the RMPs.
Yes, well, two actually. The first one turned out to be no better than that pencil-snapping MLRO we had in last time you came.
Thanks for the vote of confidence there, Andy. Hi, I'm Darren from Compliance, Risk and Prudential Services, and I've been MLRO here for just on 3 months. I'm here to give things a good shake-up. And clearly there's been issues in the past, but I'm here to make sure those issues stay in the past. I can assure you that Salary Financial Services are fully committed to meeting the ongoing RMPs set by the Commission.
And as part of those changes, we brought in Kath. as our non-executive director. She has over 20 years of experience in trust and company service roles and has held numerous directorships. And we think she'd be a real strong addition to the board.
I worked really hard at the start of my career, which has essentially allowed me to retire early. But to be honest, I'm ready for a new challenge, and I feel with my extensive experience I can be invaluable in helping the firm move forward in a positive direction.
Invaluable? You certainly know how to charge for your services.
Andy, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. I feel I've already made a really positive contribution to the board. In fact, it was my idea to review the compliance function, which led to the removal of the previous MLRO and the compliance officer. I wasn't comfortable with the BRA either, and especially because of the recent Commission criticism that it's faced. And I fully intend to support the management team in moving the firm forward in a positive direction and inspiring some confidence in them.
Well, that's an interesting board dynamic. The on-site team will be pleased to see that there's been some structural changes to the board's composition.
Yeah, definitely. I'm pleased they have Annette on board. She seems to have some positive experience and is definitely affecting some positive change.
Well, let's see if we can allay some more of those concerns from last year's visit. Let's continue.
Okay, shall we start where we always start, from the business risk assessment?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so last time we spoke to you about your top 3 money laundering and terrorist financing risks. Your answers were a bit generic. So now you provided us with a new business risk assessment, and we can see some improvements in that area, but I don't think it's gone far enough. So for example, your new business risk assessment states that your top 3 money laundering and terrorist financing risks are fraud, money laundering and regulatory risk. So what do you mean by regulatory risk?
Well, the risk of getting sanctioned, of course, by the Commission.
I'd say that's really pertinent and certainly a risk that has materialised to our business. After all, it's much more important than other padding in the bra.
Sorry, Andy, but the fact that you were sanctioned by the Commission was due to your lax corporate governance standards and poor compliance culture. That is what allowed the breaches of the regulations to occur. That is not a money laundering or terrorist financing risk.
Exactly, which is why we're revising the document. I have a draft ready at the moment awaiting approval by the board. Unfortunately, we still have a way to go.
As we all know, the business risk assessment is, or at least should be, the cornerstone of a firm's defences against money laundering and terrorist financing. All policies, procedures and controls should flow from the business risk assessment. Knowing what we do with these guys from last year, I think their top 3 risks should be bribery and corruption.
Yes, especially those African pets.
Yeah, tax evasion.
Yeah, did they ask the question, why Guernsey?
And fraud, including cybercrime.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they would understand or would know what a fraudulent email looks like.
No. And as these guys should know from the recent AML handbook consultation, there will be much greater focus on the risks associated with money laundering and terrorist financing. As a tip for anybody listening, this will be something that the Commission will be focusing on in forthcoming on-site visits.
Good point, Paul. Let's keep going though.
Okay, well, can I just ask, what level of input has the board have in respect of reviewing and updating the business risk assessment since our last visit?
Well, of course, the board are responsible for reviewing the BRA.
Yeah, and can I just say, since we've got Darren involved, we don't just sit on top and tweak the bra, we actually enforce that mechanism.
Okay, so what tweaking has happened to date, and does it include the risk of, well, pertinent risk, I'd say, of bribery and corruption?
Well, yeah, of course, we're doing all of that, and in relation to bribery and corruption, we don't encourage it.
I can assure you the document's been customised accordingly. It covers bribery and corruption from our client's perspective, as well as from our staff being unduly influenced. I'm going to be beefing up our policies and procedures, and it'll include introducing a gifts register.
Okay, and does that include the directors also?
Definitely.
Let's just take a closer look at that watch, shall we?
Yeah, now that is nice. Do you think that's automatic winding? Is that a sapphire face?
Settle there, Paul. However, it does look like they're on to a winner here with that compliance officer that they have, and well on their way to a business risk assessment that is going to be of some actual use for them.
Yeah, and as I said before, the business risk assessment should drive the policies, procedures and controls, which should in turn determine the makeup of the compliance monitoring programme. It's what I like to call the circle of compliance.
Very good, Paul. I'm sure the on-site team will be looking into this further. Let's continue.
Well, let's move on to the CMP. So am I right in assuming that this will be revised once the new BRA is approved by the board?
I suppose we'll have to look at that too.
We definitely will be looking at that. I've already started. I wasn't impressed with the CMP that was previously in place.
Okay, can you explain why?
Well, simply the CMP didn't link back to the risks identified in the BRA.
Oh. Nick, what input did the board have in the drafting of this?
Well, look, you pay these compliance experts quite a lot of money.
A lot of money.
Yeah, so you have to place some reliance on them. You know, they know what they're doing. We reviewed the programme, we universally approved it, all the reports kept on coming up green. We thought it was fine.
And the Commission was pushing us to change, so we wanted to charge ahead and show you guys that we were listening and reacting appropriately.
Right, well, it's encouraging that you're prepared to make changes, but there's no point charging ahead if, with a new CMP if it's ineffective. You know, ultimately it's the board's responsibility for this. It is the crux of Regulation 15, yeah?
Can I just point out that this is why, when I started here, I initiated a review of the compliance function. I was concerned that the CMP wasn't picking up any issues, and this led ultimately to employing Darren to take ownership of the area.
Okay, so Darren, what's the plan going forwards then?
Well, I assure you, we haven't been idle. I've started a review of the existing policies and procedures against the draft BRA. Once the BRA has been approved by the board, I'll be putting the CMP to the board for approval. I can provide you with a copy of that now if you like.
Yeah, that would be great. Just on your policies, procedures and controls, the last time we were in and we looked at the file reviews, it illuminated a number of questionable client activities. Can you just give me a quick rundown of any changes you've made to client activity monitoring, please?
Sure. Well, I think in the past there was a reliance on clients to do the right thing and inform the firm of any relevant changes. There's a big problem with late risk reviews and potential suspicious activity being missed. I've put a number of recommendations forward to the board, including implementing some specific training.
On that point, it's also worth noting that some of the relationship managers had been exercising, shall we say, some complacency regarding clients in the past. So I've prioritised speaking with a number of them personally to ensure that doesn't happen anymore, and we've also improved our procedures moving forward.
Oh, okay. So how are you going to make sure that people follow these new processes?
Well, the best way possible, of course, by hitting them in their wallet. Adherence to the new procedures, including getting their risk reviews done on time, will form part of their annual appraisal, and that's going to directly affect their discretionary bonus.
They've also been made aware that I have a seat on the Remuneration Committee, and I will be following it up periodically.
Okay, well, it seems like you have things in hand.
Well, things are definitely beginning to improve.
Yes, and to give him his due, linking compliance requirements to people's bonuses, while not a regulatory requirement,
Is a surefire way of changing the compliance culture of a firm. I like these guys. Let's continue.
Okay, so regarding the revised CMP, I would just like to get some comfort that it's going to cover the areas that we had concerns with last time we visited.
No problem.
Right, so one of the concerns that we had last time was the suitability of source of funds and source of wealth information for clients. So how is your CMP going to test that?
Darren, could you take this?
Yeah, sure. Our CMP will require dip sampling of all of our client files to ensure that we've adequately understood and documented source of funds and source of wealth. Following a recent remediation of our entire client base, I'm now confident that we have full source of funds and source of wealth information for all of our remaining clients, and we'll keep this standard up for our new clients.
Okay, well that's good to hear, Darren. But you did mention remaining clients. Well, how many were actually exited?
Andy, as Finance Director, would you like to cover this?
Yeah, sure. Well, we exited a number of clients, mainly because they were uneconomic to us or outside of our risk appetite.
Yes, well, they're certainly uneconomic now.
Andy, you mentioned a number of clients. I wonder if you could be more specific.
30%.
30%? That is quite significant. How does that make the business viable?
Well, I can tell you, as Finance Director, I've had a few sleepless nights.
Wow, Paul, 30%. They are exiting 30% of their clients. I am not surprised he had sleepless nights.
Yeah, that was an interesting development. I'm glad they picked that up. Now, from the Commission's perspective, they're going to be wondering which clients went, where they went,
And if they had any suspicions before they went. Let's continue, shall we?
Of course, this means that we need to consolidate some teams and work smarter, but no doubt it will be tough, but we'll do what we have to do to survive.
Yeah, and I can assure you that we won't be taking on any new business if it looks iffy.
Well, that is good to know, Andy. You mentioned earlier that some of the exited business was outside of your new risk appetite. Darren, can you explain whether or not any suspicious activity reports were made?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's before my time here as MLRO, but if you look at the SAR register, you can see that SARs were raised and consent to exit was always sought from the FIS. That appears to be one thing the previous MLRO actually did right.
Yes, I was comfortable with that process too. And with our improved processes for onboarding and review of the remaining clients, I feel that we're in a good place to grow within the next 2 to 3 years. And also, all of that information needs to be in place for the upcoming Register of Beneficial Ownership.
On that note, Nick, can I ask you, for example, what beneficial ownership information do you hold on that African PEP client that we looked at last time?
Who? Do you mean Mufasa?
Yes, Mufasa.
Ah, he's no longer one of our clients. He's outside of our risk appetite.
Okay.
Nick, regarding the clients that you have exited, are you able to provide us with some information such as which service providers picked them up, where they went, did they leave the jurisdiction, things like that?
I think they went to some providers in the South Pacific somewhere. I'm sure we can get a list here.
The South Pacific. Okay. Well, given that you exited them, I've got to assume that there must be some sort of high-risk characteristics to do with those clients. Can you confirm that their CDD was brought up to a level commensurate with their risk rating before they left?
What? Hey, Andy. Wade means, did you hold the right level of due diligence based on the risk of the clients before they left the jurisdiction?
Why would that be our problem?
Andy, the last thing the Commission wants is for Guernsey structures to be moving to other jurisdictions when there are gaps in the due diligence. This could be detrimental to Guernsey's reputation as a well-regulated jurisdiction. So again, can you confirm to me whether you had appropriate due diligence and that you have access to those records? You do know that that is a handbook requirement.
I'll take it from here. We'll have to get back to you on that.
Well, that was an interesting end to the meeting, don't you think, Paul? Although I don't think they've covered themselves in glory there.
No, the last thing the Commission wants to see is a Guernsey structure moving overseas when there are clear deficiencies in the CDD held. I think Nick and Andy might have some quick explaining to do there.
Yeah, I agree. But there has been some positive changes from the Commission's perspective. The new NED seems to have a good influence on the board, and the compliance officer seems to know what needs to be done.
No, definitely. I can't wait until the next episode.
All characters appearing in this work are fictitious. No licensees were harmed in the making of this film.